What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. 12 surprising facts about William Jennings Bryan. Who was William Jennings Bryan? Because he failed to win the White House in 3 attempts, he remains a footnote in American presidential politics and a relatively obscure historical figure today. However, Bryan was a nationally prominent politician, orator, and social commentator for over 4 decades whose biography intersects with some of the most important events and individuals of the early 20th century. American high school students learned about his Cross of Gold speech but probably don't remember much else about Bryan. But the historical forces he embodied are very relevant in modern times. In fact, more than one expert has compared Bryan to Donald Trump. Bryan was the inspiration for the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz. For many years, L. Frank Baum's book The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was perceived as merely a fantasy written for children. However, in 1964, an article by Henry Littlefield in a scholarly journal, The American Quarterly, made the claim that the 1900 book was also a clever political parody of both political figures and factions of the time period. Gold and silver were represented symbolically by the yellow brick road, and Dorothy's silver shoes changed to ruby slippers in the film. The wizard was actually the president of the U.S., whose power was an illusion. The wicked witches of East and West were the moneyed interests of the East and West, plus many other uncanny similarities. One of the most sarcastic was the Cowardly Lion, who was believed to be William Jennings Bryan, a blustering, fiery speaker who opposed the U.S. war against Spain in 1898. Baum was a writer who did pen various serious articles about politics, so it's not surprising that even his work ostensibly for children might reference the major political issues of his time. Bryan's presidential election of 1896 was a political slugfest. If the election of 1896 was one of the most pivotal, it was also unusually contentious. Mark Hanna, a multimillionaire industrialist who correctly viewed Bryan as a force for economic change of the American status quo, served as William McKinley's chief political advisor while he was governor of Ohio. He was able to raise sufficient funds from wealthy businessmen with similar values and northeastern bankers like J.P. Morgan to be able to outspend Bryan 12-1. In most newspapers, Bryan was routinely depicted as a dangerous, unstable radical who would destroy the fabric of American life. Hanna saw to it that every American household received printed publications that vilified Bryan as a dangerous reptile or insect. Political strategist Karl Rove has cited Mark Hanna as his most important political influence. The Scopes monkey trial harmed Bryan's reputation. The Scopes monkey trial was a 1925 American court case that adjudicated the guilt of a Tennessee teacher who had taught the concepts of evolution in a public school in violation of state law. When William Jennings Bryan heard about the case, he agreed to represent the prosecution. The ACLU then recruited Clarence Darrow, not only the foremost criminal defense attorney of the day, but also an avowed atheist. The trial became a nationwide media spectacle and was the first broadcast on radio. The climax of the case was the direct questioning of Bryan as a hostile witness in a surprise move by Darrow, who asked questions concerning biblical events that left Bryan to appear confused, short-tempered, and ignorant. In truth, the entire trial had been staged by the town fathers of Dayton to generate attention and income, and the outcome was never in doubt. From the beginning, the ACLU had been looking for a case that could be used in the appellate process that would hopefully overturn the law. The law was upheld by the Tennessee Supreme Court, but Scopes's conviction was tossed out. The state legislature would repeal the law in 1967. Bryan's humiliation in Dayton may have contributed to his death. At the Scopes trial, William Jennings Bryan's testimony and demeanor were so embarrassing that the judge in the case, John Ralston, postponed the trial to save Bryan from further harm. The next day he would not allow any further testimony from either man, ruling that such a line of questioning was not relevant. The 8-day trial and media circus that lead up to it certainly must have taken a toll on the 65-year-old Bryan. He died in his sleep in Dayton, only 5 days after the end of the trial. While his death may have been coincidental, it certainly signaled that America had left strict fundamentalism behind and was entering a new intellectual age. Bryan's fanatical religious fervor and anti-intellectualism also overshadowed his legacy as a progressive thinker and populist. A Hollywood film helped shape Bryan's negative historical image. In 1960, a major movie production of the Broadway hit play Inherit the Wind was produced, starring Spencer Tracy as Henry Drummond and Frederick March as Matthew Harrison Brady. Drummond and Brady were depictions of Darrow and Bryan, respectively, with Gene Kelly cast as a sarcastic journalist loosely based on Baltimore Sun columnist H.L. Mencken. Brady Bryan appears as a laughable religious eccentric and demagogue, his cross-examination a terrible embarrassment. In the end, the film has him collapsing while trying to give a rejoinder to Drummond's intellectual pummeling, an historical inaccuracy that still captures his status as a political has-been. The film was a critical success, and Tracy's performance was nominated for an Academy Award. An entire generation of Americans would form an opinion of Bryan based on the film. William Jennings Bryan was the youngest major party candidate for president ever. William Jennings Bryan was born in Salem, Illinois, on March 19, 1860. He was interested in politics as a young lawyer, but he saw no political future in Illinois. He moved to Nebraska and was elected to Congress, only the second Democrat to do so, but he was defeated in an 1894 bid for the U.S. Senate. On July 9, 1896, at only 36 years old, Bryan gave a speech to the Democratic Convention which is known historically as the Cross of Gold speech. The speech concerned the belief that the U.S. should adopt both a silver and gold standard as opposed to gold alone. Such an adoption would deliberately inflate the money supply, increasing the price of crops and helping many middle-class Americans escape the debt of a recent economic downturn. Bryan's speech electrified the audience and propelled him to the Democratic presidential nomination the next day. His nomination precipitated the watershed election of 1896, a bitter battle between the populist Bryan and Republican William McKinley, who was favored by banking and financial interests who opposed Bryan's economic policies. Even though the popular vote was close, McKinley won a decisive victory in the Electoral College. Here are some facts about William Jennings Bryan that return him to his rightful place at the center of American history. Bryan has won more votes than any other candidate who has never been elected president. In 1896, 1900, and 1908, William Jennings Bryan ran for president 3 times. Although he was defeated on all 3 occasions, he received a total of 493 electoral votes, more than any other candidate never elected president. The only other politician who is even close to this record is Republican Thomas E. Dewey with 288 electoral votes, although Dewey only ran for president twice. Bryan only spent 2 years in any position of political power. By 1912, after losing 3 presidential campaigns, Bryan was no longer a serious national political contender, but he did have considerable influence over the Democratic Party. At the 1912 Democratic Convention, Bryan used his influence to help nominate Woodrow Wilson. When Wilson was elected president, he selected Bryan as his Secretary of State. Other than his brief stint in Congress, this was Bryan's only major political office, which he would only hold for a little over 2 years. Bryan was generally opposed to any foreign policy that he labeled as imperialist, and when it appeared that President Wilson and others were using the sinking of the Lusitania as a pretext to involve the U.S. in World War I, Bryan resigned. Bryan's brother was nominated for vice president, chiefly out of name recognition. John W., an attorney and former congressman, was nominated by the Democratic Party in 1924. Davis for president. Because Davis was a conservative closely associated with Northeastern political and financial interests, the Democrats wanted to balance their ticket with a Midwestern populist. Since the ultimate populist, William Jennings Bryan, wasn't feasible or available, the party settled on his brother, Charles Bryan, a nominee who was seen as a concession to the party's populist and prohibitionist elements. Bryan was the governor of Nebraska, perceived as even more radical than William Jennings Bryan, and made for a disjointed presidential ticket that would be handily defeated by Calvin Coolidge. Still, Charles W. and William Jennings Bryan are the only 2 brothers ever nominated for president or vice president. An alleged populist, Bryan became quite wealthy from his speaking tours. Bryan was out of politics and needed to make a living after his defeat in the 1900 election. He became one of the most popular paid speakers on what was known as the Chautauqua Circuit, a nationwide educational organization that provided enlightenment and entertainment. Because edifying and inspirational lectures were the focus of this experience, Bryan gave speeches on topics like the Prince of Peace, comparing the words and deeds of Jesus Christ to the core principles of individual public service. Bryan charged $500 for a speech, and even continued to give paid Chautauqua presentations when he was the Secretary of State. This income was one of the major sources of Bryan's considerable wealth. Bryan also made a fortune peddling Florida real estate, which ultimately went bust. Towards the end of his life, William Jennings Bryan hooked up with a Florida land speculator named George Merrick to help sell newly developed real estate. Bryan had been involved in the temperance and anti-evolution movements and was perceived as deeply religious and morally above reproach. He publicly talked up Florida investments and used his positive public reputation to encourage interest in the Miami Riviera and God's sunshine, all while paid by Merrick to sit under an umbrella on a raft to lecture on the benefits of Florida real estate. Such marketing set off wild speculation in Florida real estate, but a savage hurricane and a market crash in 1927 left many investors high and dry. While Merrick paid Bryan $100,000 a year in cash and real estate, the great commoner tried to conceal his net worth, claiming that it was less than $500,000. When he died, his will revealed that his net worth was a lot higher. Bryan's funeral was a big deal. In the United States, the death of William Jennings Bryan was a momentous event. Despite the rhetorical defeat he took at the hands of Clarence Darrow and the scorn of Northeastern newspapermen, Bryan was a hero to many deeply religious, middle-class Americans. When he died on July 26, 1925, after leading a church service in Dayton, Tennessee only 5 days after the conclusion of the Scopes trial, many saw him as a martyr who had been pilloried by godless atheists and political radicals. Thousands paid their respects at his open casket in Dayton. Flags flew at half-mast and his casket was sent to Washington, D.C., by a special train. Political friends and foes both attended his burial at Arlington National Cemetery. William Jennings Bryan remains one of the most influential, complicated, and misunderstood figures in American history. Although largely remembered today as a 3-time failed presidential candidate and the prosecuting attorney who famously floundered in the 1925 Scopes monkey trial, Bryan was a political dynamo, a formidable orator, and a major cultural force at the turn of the 20th century. His life intersected with crucial developments in American political, religious, and social history, and he left a legacy that reverberates into the present day. Here are 12 surprising facts about William Jennings Bryan that help illuminate the depth and complexity of this fascinating man. Bryan was the inspiration for the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz. Frank Baum's allegorical tale, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the Cowardly Lion is widely believed to represent Bryan, who was often derided for his impassioned rhetoric but perceived lack of political success. Bryan was a fierce opponent of U.S. imperialism, particularly during the Spanish-American War. The Cowardly Lion, while loud and seemingly brave, ultimately lacked the fortitude to act decisively, a characteristic attributed by critics to Bryan, especially after his electoral defeats. Bryan's 1896 presidential campaign was one of the most contentious in U.S. history. Bryan's first run for the presidency in 1896 was a dramatic and polarizing affair. Running as a populist Democrat, he championed the cause of bimetallism, the use of both gold and silver to back U.S. currency, to help farmers and working-class Americans. His famous Cross of Gold speech electrified the Democratic National Convention and earned him the nomination at just 36 years old. The Republican opponent, William McKinley, supported by powerful financiers like Mark Hanna and J.P. Morgan, outspent Bryan by a massive margin and used media campaigns to paint him as a radical threat to American stability. The Scopes monkey trial tarnished Bryan's legacy. In 1925, Bryan volunteered to assist in the prosecution of John Scopes, a Tennessee teacher accused of violating state law by teaching evolution. Though the trial was meant to challenge the legality of the law and provoke a public discussion about science and religion, Bryan found himself ridiculed by the defense attorney, Clarence Darrow. When Darrow called Bryan as a witness and grilled him on biblical literalism, Bryan appeared confused and intellectually outmatched. The moment became emblematic of the cultural divide between modernism and religious traditionalism. Bryan died just days after the Scopes trial ended. The stress and public humiliation of the Scopes trial appeared to weigh heavily on Bryan. Just 5 days after the trial ended, Bryan died in his sleep while in Dayton, Tennessee. He had delivered a sermon the day before, defending his beliefs and seemingly unshaken by the trial's outcome. Some speculate that the emotional toll of the trial contributed to his death. Regardless, his passing marked the end of an era in American religious and political life. Inherit the Wind cemented Bryan's unflattering historical image. The 1960 film adaptation of the play, Inherit the Wind, fictionalized the Scopes trial and depicted Bryan as a bumbling, outdated religious zealot. The movie was meant to be a defense of intellectual freedom against McCarthyism, but it also painted a negative picture of Bryan that stayed in people's minds. Frederick March played the Bryan character Matthew Harrison Brady as a deluded and broken man, collapsing in the courtroom, a dramatic liberty that many now accept as historical fact. He was the youngest person ever nominated by a major party for the presidency. Bryan was just 36 years old when he accepted the Democratic nomination in 1896. His youth and charisma helped him connect with a new generation of voters, and his oratorical skills made him one of the most compelling political figures of the era. Although he lost the election to McKinley, Bryan's campaign redefined political speechmaking and mass engagement in the electoral process. Bryan holds the record for the most votes cast in an election without being elected president. Despite never securing the presidency, Bryan remains the candidate who received the most electoral votes, 493, without winning. He ran in 1896, 1900, and 1908, losing to McKinley twice and William Howard Taft once. His persistence in the face of defeat and his continued influence on the Democratic Party made him a significant figure well into the 20th century. His only major office was Secretary of State. Although a major force in American politics, Bryan only held one significant political office, U.S. Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson. He served from 1913 to 1915 but resigned in protest after the sinking of the Lusitania, which he feared would drag the U.S. into World War I. A devout pacifist, Bryan believed diplomacy and neutrality were the keys to international peace. His brother was nominated for vice president. In 1924, the Democratic Party selected Charles W. Bryan, William's brother, as its vice presidential nominee in an effort to appeal to populist and prohibitionist voters. Though Charles was less charismatic and more radical than William, his family name lent him significant political capital. But incumbent Calvin Coolidge easily defeated the ticket. Bryan made a fortune on the Chautauqua circuit. After leaving politics, Bryan became a sought-after public speaker, traveling across the country on the Chautauqua circuit, which provided educational and cultural programs in rural America. His speeches, including The Prince of Peace, drew large crowds and earned him substantial fees, $500 per appearance, equivalent to thousands today. His reputation as a moral and religious authority made him especially appealing to middle-class Americans seeking guidance during turbulent times. He also cashed in on Florida real estate. Bryan joined Florida land developer George Merrick in promoting the Coral Gables project during the 1920s real estate boom. He was paid handsomely, over $100,000 annually, to lend his name and credibility to the venture. He often floated on a raft and gave inspirational lectures about the virtues of Florida living. However, a devastating hurricane and the collapse of the Florida land bubble ruined many investors, tarnishing Bryan's reputation among those who had trusted his word. Bryan's funeral was a national event. Despite the ridicule he faced late in life, Bryan's death triggered an outpouring of grief from supporters across the country. Seen by many as a martyr for Christian values and a symbol of Middle America's moral compass, his funeral was attended by thousands. Flags flew at half-mast, and his body was transported to Washington, D.C., for burial at Arlington National Cemetery. Even his political enemies paid their respects, acknowledging his profound impact on American political life. In the end, William Jennings Bryan defies easy categorization. He was a pacifist and a moralist, a populist and a progressive, a religious fundamentalist and a modern political pioneer. Though his influence has been eclipsed by the more flamboyant or victorious figures of American history, the ideals he fought for, economic fairness, peace, moral integrity, remain cornerstones of the American political conscience. To understand Bryan is to understand the soul of a divided, striving nation at a crossroads of modernity and tradition. 12 surprising facts about William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan remains one of the most fascinating yet underappreciated figures in American political history. A three-time presidential candidate, fiery orator, and polarizing progressive, Bryan shaped debates over monetary policy, evolution, and U.S. imperialism in ways that still resonate today. Though he never won the White House, his influence was immense, from inspiring a character in The Wizard of Oz to dying just days after the infamous Scopes monkey trial. Below are 12 surprising facts about the great commoner that reveal why he was far more complex and controversial than most history books suggest. 1. He was the inspiration for the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz. Many scholars believe L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, 1900, was a political allegory. The yellow brick road equals the gold standard. Dorothy's silver shoes, changed to ruby in the movie, equals free silver movement. The Cowardly Lion equals William Jennings Bryan, a blustery but ultimately powerless figure who opposed the Spanish-American War. Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech, 1896, made him a hero to farmers and laborers, but critics saw him as all roar, no bite. 2. His 1896 presidential campaign was one of the nastiest in history. Bryan's populist, pro-silver platform terrified Wall Street and big business. His opponent, William McKinley, was bankrolled by industrialist Mark Hanna, who outspent Bryan 12-1. Flooded newspapers with cartoons depicting Bryan as a snake or anarchist. Warned that Bryan's policies would destroy the economy. Sound familiar? Political strategist Karl Rove has cited Hanna as a major influence. 3. The Scopes monkey trial destroyed his reputation. In 1925, Bryan joined the prosecution in the Scopes trial, defending Tennessee's ban on teaching evolution. Clarence Darrow, a famed atheist lawyer, humiliated Bryan on the stand, exposing his biblical literalism and lack of scientific knowledge. The trial, broadcast nationally on radio, turned Bryan into a laughingstock among intellectuals. He passed away just 5 days later, and many people blamed the trial's stress.